Hello, it's Kelly Jensen again with Ted Lare, and we're going through homesteading hints again. Um, this episode is about planting vegetables in pots, and it's actually a little bit early for some things right now to be planted in pots. But since I don't use pots, we're just going to kind of go through everything, and I'll show you how to do it when it's time. Um, this pot is probably, I suppose it's a 30-gallon pot, something like that, which actually to me would be about perfect on the size, um, just because it'll fit just about anything in it, and it'll have enough root growth room. So you can use just about anything in it. And this is my cat OJ, and he needs to stay away while we're discussing this. But anyhow, what you could plant now would be a lettuce, spinach, or a mixture of that. You could put radishes in a pot. They wouldn't have to be a pot this large for those things because the roots don't really reach as far on that. But the more, obviously, the more space you have, surface area you have, the more you can put into it. And I would do the same thing as I did out in the garden, which is I would just broadcast seed it in here and mix it in a little bit with my hands, and then soak it down, and you could cover this entire thing with lettuce and or spinach or a combination of both, and you could probably cut off that for quite some time. Now the reason that we're going through potted gardens is for those of you who are living in an apartment or a condo or something like that, or just don't have enough room in your yard. You can still grow your own vegetables, and actually I know a number of people that do, and they do really well with it. You just are going to have to adjust to the differences in how you garden and how you vegetable garden. So we're going to kind of go through that, and you'll probably just kind of have to learn as you go what works for you. Obviously we are in a kind of a shady spot right now. We are on the east side of the house, which would be fine, especially for the cool season crops. They would last a lot longer. Things like lettuce and spinach would last a lot longer. But you could do tomatoes and things like this as well, but it would take a little bit longer for them to ripen. So if you have a full sun area, you're going to probably do better with things like peppers and tomatoes, herbs, things like that. Even some of the herbs would prefer some coolness as well, but herbs can pretty much tolerate a lot of different things. So you could literally put kind of a combination of things in it, and that's what we're going to talk about today in this pot. We're actually going to plant tomato. We're planting tomato in here, and then in front of it, I don't have any of my herbs with me, or well, they're just not ready yet. But I would put a tomato about here in this size of a pot, and I would dig it down, and actually I would dig it down so that it would be to where these two are the first leaves that come onto the plant, and I would dig it clear down. Now, by the way, too, this is one of our seedlings that we planted on March 15th, so it's only a month old. So for those of you that think you have to plant them way early, this plant is a very healthy big plant already, and we still have about 3 weeks before we put them out. At least 2 weeks before we put them out. Will depend on what the weather's looking like. But I would bury it clear down and snap these leaves off the bottom and bury it down to about here, so that it about that much is out of the ground and the rest is below ground. Now tomatoes will put roots on everything on their stem. They're not all plants do this. You can't plant all plants deep, but tomatoes you obviously can, because they will start shooting out roots all the way up the stem to every part that's actually below ground. So I always plant tomatoes deep. And what I would also do on this one is I would put some eggshells down in the bottom of the hole first. Eggshells are all calcium pretty much, and if you don't have eggshells, you could do like some sort of a slow release calcium type of a organic fertilizer or something on that order. But I would put some underneath of it, and that will break down as the plant grows. Now calcium is important because it can prevent root rot on the new tomatoes coming onto the plant. Or not root rot, but blossom end rot. Sorry. But that blossom end rot is caused absolutely by calcium deficiency. So if you stick that eggshell down in the bottom of it, you're going to help that plant out, and it's going to be a slow release because eggshell is going to take a while to break down. So by the time it gets bigger and starts producing, that eggshell will be breaking down and giving to that plant. So I would definitely put some eggshell. I do it out in the garden as well, but I would do it in this too. Okay, so I would plant this, and then I would bring in my basil, actually, and I would probably put 2 or 3 or 4 basil in front of it, right around here, and the tomato will grow up the backside of it. And the tomato is going to come out probably quite a ways, probably about here, I suppose, maybe even a little bit farther. So the basil you want kind of around that front edge. And basil is a shallower rooted plant. Tomatoes can be extremely deep rooted. So they're kind of taking over different sections of the pot. So you can utilize that by having multiple crops in your pot. And actually, many people use basil along with tomatoes in a lot of the recipes. So they do work out very well together, and it just so happens that they also taste good together. So, now this reason I have this in the back is this is how I would choose to hold up the tomato. Rather than taking a whole tomato cage, which you can do on these, and if you were only going to put a tomato directly in the center of, say, a smaller pot like this one, which I would only put a tomato in that one because you really can't fit anything else in it. But then I would think about putting a tomato cage right inside the pot and use that to hold it up. Since this is bigger and we plan on doing some other things in it, I would put just a stake in it, and then I would take and loosely loop like some twine or some floral wire, something, shoestring would work, yes. Anything that's kind of soft but still holds it in place. You don't want something that's really going to be too abrasive to it. But as it grows, I would just go ahead and loop around all the way up your little post here, and it will hold the tomato from falling over. Okay, so pepper, you could do the same thing with peppers. Peppers usually aren't going to grow nearly as big as a tomato, so you know your post wouldn't have to be as tall, and you could plant other things in here, and the pepper isn't going to take up as much room. So that's just some of the ideas. I mean, you could probably put cucumbers into a pot. You could do different things like some of the bush cucumbers, or you could do a climbing cucumber that actually fell out over the edge and let it hang from the pot. So there's a number of different vegetables you could use. You could do all herbs in pots, and a lot of people do that. Herbs are utilized quite a bit because if you can have the fresh herbs right up by the house, even if someone has a garden with other stuff in it, you might go out and snip some rosemary or thyme or basil or whatever to use in some of your recipes. Maybe that's just a quick and easy and extremely fresh way to do things. So it actually is a pretty slick deal to have some by the house sometimes. But herbs are extremely good to use in pots. Lettuce and radishes and spinach will be good to use. I would say, and not necessarily recommend any root crop like carrots beyond radishes. Radishes are still shallow, but carrots go deep. Turnips go deep. Beets go deep. Probably you couldn't do that sort of thing very easily in pots. You could do potatoes in pots, which it would depend. I mean, you would not want to use a nice pot like this. You would want to use a lighter pot because you would have to dump it out to get the potatoes out of it. So more recommending something more of a useful rather than something showy like this. But if you just have a showy thing and you want to do vegetables, you can do this. Now some of the differences in potted vegetables. Number one, I hardly ever water the garden, hardly ever. But these will have to be watered daily, probably once the heat comes on in the summer. Now we're a little bit cooler. You'll just have to monitor that. Sometimes you'll probably even have to water them twice a day, especially things like tomatoes that can just get a huge root system on them. They're going to need watered quite often. Now, I would recommend this because this is another thing. The soil in your pot is going to run out of nutrients fairly quickly with all this root growth and everything in it. And the plants are going to be looking and needing more nutrients. Obviously, you can't really put extra compost in it. You can't really put mulch on top of it that's going to break down and go into the soil. But you can take what's called a compost tea. And compost tea is essentially water, which I prefer, again, rainwater. If you can, get a little rain barrel or catch some on the next rain by putting it under your downspout and catching a couple of 5-gallon buckets full and having those around, because that'll last quite a while. But then take, and if you drink tea or you drink coffee, you can put the grounds of either one of those into your compost tea and let it soak for 24 hours, 48 hours, something like that, to where it's pulling those chemicals out of there, because they make really good fertilizer, and it's an organic fertilizer, obviously, and you can utilize it in your compost tea. Other things you can put in compost tea: ground up leaves, dried leaves. You can use green leaves as well, but they don't break down quite as good. Things like stinging nettles, which actually is a really good green compost tea mix. Obviously, it does sting, and if you do have or know of any around, you'll have to be careful with that. But it makes a great compost tea for especially tomatoes. I don't even remember what exactly the nutrient that it has when you crush it up and you put it in the water that leaches out of it, but tomatoes absolutely love it. So the compost tea is basically, it's all water soluble, and so when it breaks down in the water, you just use it when you're watering, and it's not going to heap up and add organic matter to it, but it's going to give the organic chemicals, the nitrogen and some of the potassium and things like that are in what you're breaking down back into the soil without adding matter to it. And that's what you'll need to do on pots or raised beds or anything like that. Keep in mind that it's going to dry out quickly because it's surrounded by dryness. It's not just the ground here that's the dry spot that the water can be taken and evaporated away. The sides are going to heat up. They're going to dry out quicker because the sides are baking as well. So the temperature is going to be hotter, things like that. So that'll all have to be monitored when you plant things. But it can be done, and actually, we at the garden center we have several varieties of tomatoes that we just ordered this year that are meant for. They're called minis. They're meant for pots. They're meant for
patio gardens.
Patio garden, basically. Okay, and I believe we might have even had a couple of peppers. Now, I read up a little bit on varieties of tomatoes. If you're looking at heirloom varieties, Brandywine, which we have at the garden center as well, is an heirloom variety tomato that it's one of the top ones that they recommend for potted. I know that black crim can be used. I know that most cherry tomatoes can be used and are used because they actually seem to do very well in pots. Blue Beauty is one that we have that I know is used well in pots or in raised beds, because it's very vigorous under compacted situations as well. So all those varieties and there are probably others. If you want to look up, if you have a favorite variety and you want to check on it, you can Google it, and most of the time they'll tell you whether it works well or not. There are certain varieties that get way too big, and so you have to be careful of that, because that will overtake a whole pot, or even could end up catching the wind and tipping the whole pot over, as large as they sometimes get. But I think that's about it. Libby has something here.
Can you talk a little bit about the soil? I mean, like bone meal, fish meal, worm castings.
Right, you can use worm castings in the mix. Now, this is just a regular potting soil mix. It's called Sungrow. We have it at the garden center. I use it primarily for everything. But if you wanted to put in a worm casting is really, it is a fertilizer, but it's an extreme organic fertilizer that's very concentrated, but it also can't really be overdone. So you could pour just about as much as you wanted to on it, and it wouldn't burn up your plants. So worm casting would work real good if you mix it in that as well. Again, you know, liquefying it would work, which actually I've also heard that you can take that and you can put it into the 5-gallon bucket as a compost tea and let the worm casting soak in your compost tea and then drain it out, and you know, just run it through a colander or something like that to where you're catching the chunks but you're still using all of the nutrients that are in the worm casting. It would work real well as well if you don't have, you know, access to leaves or you don't do coffee or tea or whatever. So yes, any of that kind of stuff. Bone meal would work, things like that. You could utilize just about any sort of a good organic, and I prefer organic fertilizer, I guess you could call it, or organic mixes in the soil, just because you're going to be eating it. So I mean, I prefer not to eat chemical, unless it's some sort of an organic addition.
Each year.
Yeah, each year you are going to want to change the soil out. It's going to very much deplete the nutrients and very much work into, I mean, this is going to be soil that's going to need a rest, basically. I'm not saying dump it out in the trash. If you have a place to put it, or somebody that would want it to fill holes in the yard or whatever, you know, you can utilize it again. But in a pot, this is a very intense batch of roots, and you know, it's pulling a lot up for you to eat. And when you eat it, you're getting nutrients out of it. So obviously it's getting them from somewhere, and it's getting them from the soil. And so every year you're going to need to change this out, just because it's going to be very tough. It's like adding compost, adding straw to your garden, only this you can't really do that way. So yes, you're going to have to change out the soil. But you know, it's a very different way of gardening, but it can be very successful. And I know of a number of people that do it, and they do it well, and they get a lot of produce from their garden. So you don't have to just not have vegetables just because you don't have enough space for them. You can actually do things like this and still have your share of garden produce. So and if you have any questions, just you know, you can send an email to Ted Lare and or from, you know, through this video, and ask any questions you want, and we'll get back with you. So you could call as well. So you know, ask for me if you want it, Ted Lare or Melissa or somebody like that. We'll get a hold of me and we can get back to you. So any questions, just do that. Otherwise, I think we're done with this, and until next week, have fun. Thanks.